Hello and welcome to this edition of CSA Talks Today. I'm Ayşe Süberker, and today I'm joined by Mr. Fogh Rasmussen, whom you have known as former Prime Minister of Denmark or former Chief of Nato. But today, Mr. Rasmussen joins us with a different hat, not too detached from what he had done before. He currently heads the Alliance of Democracies Foundation, based in Copenhagen. Mr. Rasmussen, thank you for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Before we expand on our conversation, Mr. Rasmussen, tell us about this foundation of yours, why you felt the urge to set up such an organization out of boredom, or are democracies around the world under threat?
Yeah, it it was definitely not out of boredom. On the contrary, I feel that there is a burning platform. During the last 15 years, democracies have been weakened, autocracies have been strengthened. So in 2017, I established a non-profit foundation, the Alliance of Democracies Foundation. And one of our activities is to organize an annual democracy summit in Copenhagen. But we're also running other programs such as education of young leaders in emerging democracies, and we're supporting democracy activists all over the world. So it's a very vast program.
Mm-hmm. You say the authoritarian tide has risen, but a global alliance of democracy would help it turn it back. Is this an ambitious goal, and what challenges you're likely to face?
Well, it is indeed a very ambitious goal, because we have seen that the world's free societies have been very split and disunited on many occasions. But later this year, the new President Biden of the United States will organize and host a global summit for democracies. And that's very much in line with my idea. Actually, President Biden inaugurated our first democracy summit in Copenhagen back in 2018. So I'm fully in line with his thinking. And I think it's necessary to establish this alliance or partnership between the world's free societies, because together we represent 60% of the global economy. And that's a formidable might that will create some respect in Beijing and in other capitals of the autocratic states.
Okay, we're going to get into those threats, but your foundation, as you've just mentioned, looks like it has the full support of US President Joe Biden. Other than the US, which countries are on board? Do you think the President Biden will be able to unite Europe as a whole to confront those threats?
Yeah, I think so, because he's not alone in this. For instance, G7, which is the gathering of the world's seven biggest economies, will now pursue exactly the same goal. This year, it's chaired by the United Kingdom, and the United Kingdom has made it a central purpose of this year's work to create a kind of alliance of democracies. They call it D10 or D11. So at the G7 meeting in June this year, the G7 countries, that is the seven biggest economies in this world, will invite four other countries to join them, namely Australia.
Countries? Yes.
Yeah, it's Australia, South Korea, India, and South Africa. Mm-hmm. So they will gather 11 democracies in the world. And I think that could be the core group of a larger group of democracies. My assessment would be that 90 or 100 countries worldwide would qualify for joining this alliance of democracies. So the United States will not be alone in this. There'll be a lot of other countries assisting in building this alliance.
You talk about 10 to 11 countries. Do you believe that this organization could expand in the near future? And what would be the criteria to joining such an organization?
Yeah, that's a key question. And of course, the details, the devil resides in the details here, because what is the access ticket to this alliance? But obviously, it will be to fulfill criteria like regular, free and fair elections have to be organized in democracies. You have to respect free speech, freedom of religion, rule of law, and independent judiciary, just to mention some of the fundamentals that must be achieved or fulfilled to join this alliance. But no one should be excluded. I mean, if a country suddenly changes into becoming a democracy, they should also be allowed to join the club of the world's democracies.
Change overnight. Just that brings me the question of India. Do you believe that India is a full-fledged democracy?
Basically, yes. Of course, you can always, in all societies, think you can point fingers at this or that. But basically, India is a democracy. And compared, for instance, to China, there's no doubt that India is a free society with regular elections. Of course, I mean, 1.4 billion people, that's a lot. And it's hard to manage a democracy like that. But I think I would qualify India as basically a free and open society and a democracy.
Okay, so will this organization D10, 11, or let's say D20, will it serve as an alternative to the United Nations or NATO?
No, and that's important to stress. It won't be an alternative. It will be a supplement, because we need a forum where democracies can meet and have a conversation with their adversaries, the autocrats. We need that forum. Mm-hmm. So we need the United Nations still. But what we also need is a better coordination among the world's democracies. Mm-hmm. Because I think if we join forces, then we can speak out much louder and we can confront the autocracies. Take, for instance, China. Mm-hmm. China joined the World Trade Organization back in 2002. We hoped that gradually China would live up to its international commitments. But what we have seen is that China has actually exploited the rules of the World Trade Organization and introduced unfair trade practices. So our companies have to compete with state-subsidized Chinese companies. And they have purchased strategically important assets in our countries. I mean, all this has to be addressed, and we can do it from a position of strength if we do it together, if we coordinate our policies within the World Trade Organization, within the World Health Organization, within the United Nations. So we still need the United Nations and all other multilateral organizations, but we also need a stronger coordination among the world's democracies.
Is it because of China is one of the National Security Council members, and instead of forming this D10, D11, what you call, should the United Nations be modernized so as to meet the challenges of today? Is this a very hard job? Is setting up a D10 easier?
As basically, we should reform the United Nations.
Mm.
I'm very much in favor of that. But realistically speaking, it's not possible because that will require unanimity among the five permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, including China
Mhm.
and Russia. So it's not possible. So we have to find other ways forward. So while keeping the United Nations as it is, we should cooperate much stronger among the world's democracies. That's my vision.
Okay, let's talk about a little bit about NATO. I mean, after Trump era, we know he was an isolationist. Do you believe that his presidency hurt NATO's credibility? How it has performed during Trump's tenure?
Yes, I mean, Trump's public statements undermined the credibility of NATO
Mhm.
and thereby weakened NATO. But the paradox is that at the same time, NATO has been militarily strengthened during the last 4 years because uh, member states have invested much more in defense. Um, and I think Trump could also take some credit for that. I mean, he used harsh rhetorics to force allies to really live up to their commitments, including investing at least 2% of the total production in defense. And more allies do that. I mean, we have at least 10 now. When we took the decision, only 3 allies fulfilled that criteria. Now it's 10. And I think half of the allies are pretty close to fulfilling the 2% criteria. So we are investing more in defense, and at the same time, we have strengthened territorial defense in Eastern Europe. So militarily, NATO has been strengthened, but politically, NATO has been weakened because Trump raised doubts about his commitment to the famous Article 5. That is the article in the NATO treaty that states that we consider an attack on one ally an attack on all allies. And he said, you can't be sure that the United States will come to your defense. If you don't live up to your commitments, we will not help you. So he raised doubts about Article 5, which might tempt uh, Putin and other adversaries to really test the resolve of the United States and the alliance. So, in conclusion, NATO has been politically weakened, but militarily strengthened.
Do you think nowadays Russia is testing NATO's resolve, especially in the Black Sea?
Without any doubt, yes. We have seen it in Ukraine. While Ukraine is not a member of NATO, of course, from a strategic point of view, Ukraine is extremely important. And we recently saw how the Russians massed up troops along the Ukrainian borders, and that was in an attempt to test the resolve of the new Biden administration and thereby also NATO. Exactly the same goes for the Black Sea, where we have seen the Russians actually block civilian traffic for quite some time, and they can do it again. So the Black Sea and Ukraine are at the core of Russian tests of our resolve.
Do you think the tensions are likely to escalate in the future?
if we don't act now, yes, but we have a chance, in my opinion, to reduce tensions. And paradoxically, we can reduce tensions by stepping up our demonstration of clear resolve. Because Putin only respects a firm stance, a united stance, and strong language. And if we are split across the Atlantic, for instance, if we don't act now, then we are sending the wrong signal to Putin, and he will consider that a weakness that he can exploit. So my conclusion is, if we remain passive, then we will see tensions rise. If we take a firm stance, for instance, by blocking the new Nord Stream 2 pipeline in the Baltic Sea, or take other steps that really would hurt the Russian economy.
But that would also hurt the German economy as well if the Germans pull out of this Nord Stream 2 project.
No, it won't. I mean, they have alternatives. The Nord Stream 2 pipeline is not necessary for energy reasons. It's a geopolitical project with the aim to keep the Europeans dependent on imported Russian gas. And whenever the Russians would like to do so, they can cut off the supplies of gas to Europe. We have seen that in the past. We risk to see that in the future as well. And there's no doubt that if we stop the Nord Stream 2 project, it would send a very clear signal to Putin that cooperation is better for Russia than the current confrontation.
So how are you concretely planning to confront the Russian and Chinese threats? You just said we can't remain passive, but I guess you don't want to be aggressive too. So through sanctions, because we know that they never work. And I read that your foundation has also been sanctioned by China. What have you done?
Nothing. I mean, we continue our business. That's right. When China retaliated, the European Union sanctions against a few Chinese individuals in the Xinjiang province. We were among the sanctions foundations in the EU. But of course, our resolve to continue the fight for freedom, for democracy, to create an alliance of democracies that will continue irrespective of the Chinese sanctions.
How will it impact your foundation?
We don't know, but the Chinese stated that individuals, including me, are not allowed to travel to China. I had no plans to do such travels anyway. So I mean, of course I cannot give concessions because of threats from an autocratic communist regime in Beijing. That's not possible. But let me stress, I'm not anti-China. I'm not anti-Chinese. On the contrary, as Prime Minister of Denmark, I signed a strategic partnership agreement between Denmark and China back in 2008, hoping that China was on the course towards more openness, more integration in the international economy. So I wanted to send that positive signal. But in 2012, Xi Jinping took power in China, and China has now turned into a more nationalistic and more aggressive nation. You're right. As a point of departure, sanctions are not the best weapon. But what is the alternative? We don't want a military confrontation. So I think we should use an array of instruments where sanctions may be one. And I think the sanctions should be targeted against individuals around Putin, around Xi Jinping. But in addition to that, we should also be more firm when it comes to security. For instance, we should clearly state that if China intends to attack Taiwan, to reunite Taiwan and mainland China, then we will defend Taiwan, not only the US, but also the Europeans.
So we know that many European countries have billion-dollar projects with China, and some economies depend on it. And now China has launched this Belt and Road Initiative, which covers African countries, some European countries as well. So do you believe that they could afford to lose at the expense of trying to make China more democratic?
That's a key question. And that's why it's so important that the world's democracies stand together, because then it's impossible for China to blackmail individual countries. So far, China has tended to take out and blackmail, in particular, the small nations like Norway, like Sweden, but not the bigger countries like Germany, for instance, or France. And if the world's democracies create an alliance and help each other against economic blackmail from China, then we are much more efficient. Actually, I think, in line with what we spoke about before about the NATO Article 5, where we state that we will come to help an ally that might be attacked. Exactly the same way, we should introduce an economic Article 5, where the world's democracies help each other if China attacks one country economically. For instance, recently, China attacked Australia by introducing tariffs on Australian wine. In that case, I think we should all say, okay, now we will help Australia, or we will retaliate against China. So if that kind of blackmail doesn't pay off, then it will stop. So that might be an efficient instrument against the autocracies.
Do you have a timetable for that? When do you think that the world democracies could get together and form this alliance? Do you have a certain timetable?
Now, many years in politics have taught me that you should be a bit cautious about outlining timetables. But we already now know that in June, G7 will meet in the UK and add the 4 big democracies. So at D11 will meet and discuss how to move forward. Later this year, President Biden will organize and host the World Global Summit for Democracy. So 2021 will be the start of this process. But I do not envisage a formal organization in the very near term. Rather, I think what we could expect is an annual gathering of the world's democracies, a formal gathering where they can coordinate policies. So I would envisage a new meeting in 22, etc. I think we should. The timetable is not the most important thing. The most important thing is to get the democracies to understand how important it is to work together. The US is one thing, the EU, NATO are another bodies, but we should add to that Australia, Japan, India, South Korea, South Africa, and some of the big countries, the big democracies in Latin America, etc. So
it's mention New Zealand. Why is that?
Oh, but of course, but I haven't mentioned a lot of countries. As I said, I would think that around 90 countries in the world would qualify for joining the alliance, and definitely also New Zealand.
Okay, so Mr. Rasmussen, before we move forward to election meddling, coronavirus and everything, I just want to wrap up this segment by asking you, now the president of the United States, Biden, has moved away from decades-old US foreign policy. Do you believe that his administration will be able to adapt to the dramatic changes on the ground, especially in the Middle East, or will it lay its eyes more on Indo-Pacific region?
I don't think it's correct to describe it as a deviation from traditional American foreign policy. On the contrary, I think President Biden represents the same American foreign policy that has been pursued since Truman established a new world order in the wake of the Second World War. But I would describe Trump as a deviation from the classical American foreign policy. So your question is, will it be possible for President Biden to resume what I would call a more classical American foreign policy? And my answer is yes. I couldn't think of anyone better to do that than President Biden. I've known President Biden for many years. He served as vice president when I was NATO secretary general. We worked together after we stepped down from public office. And he is really a consensus-oriented politician with a vast political network abroad as well as in the United States. He knows almost everybody. So I can't think of anyone better to do that than President Biden. And while Trump used harsh rhetorics against China, I think Biden will be able to produce more tangible results because he will build this alliance, and by that, he will put much more pressure on China.
All right. So as the coronavirus pandemic continued to upend countless lives and rattle the global economy, national interests have often clashed with global priorities. What's your take on that? Has the world given a good test in the past 1.5 years?
No, I mean, the pandemic has demonstrated the need for more, not less, cooperation globally. And I stress this because there is a tendency that countries are now looking inward instead of looking outward, and instead of cooperating much stronger. But take the World Health Organization. It needs, of course, profound reforms. Mm-hmm. But so far, the overall response to the pandemic has been a failure, in my opinion. So we need to be much better prepared in the future to counter such pandemics, because this will not be the last one.
Yes. Yes. So you've been working on the Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity. What is it you want to achieve? Could you expand on this? What is this elections meddling?
Yeah, actually, Joe Biden and I co-founded the Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity back in 2018. Mm-hmm. The purpose of this commission is to monitor the meddling into election campaigns and our democratic processes in general. It is to detect disinformation campaigns and it is to develop tools to counter those attempts to spread false information and disinformation. We have monitored election campaigns, not only in the US, but also the European parliamentary elections in Georgia, in Taiwan, the referendum campaign in North Macedonia, just to mention some, or in Ukraine, not to forget. We have monitored all that and also concluded there were a lot of attempts to spread disinformation and impact on the election campaign.
So how do you plan to fight this foreign elections meddling then?
Yeah, we use many different tools. As an example, we will engage in the German election campaign later this year. They have a parliamentary election on the 26th of September. And we are now engaged in Germany to monitor what is going on. For instance, we have detected we have developed tools to detect attempts to spread disinformation through the so-called bots. You can use automatic bots to amplify fake news, for instance. And this is just one thing. Another thing is deep fake videos. We demonstrated the strength of deep fake videos and also difficulty to actually identify them. A couple of years ago, we produced a video with 3 editions of President Trump: a true Trump, an actor that pretended to speak like Trump, and thirdly, a machine speaking like Trump.
Okay.
So we published those 3 editions, and then we asked people to identify which one is a true Trump and which are the fake Trumps. People couldn't do that. And you can imagine how it would damage the image of a politician and which impact it would have on an election campaign if you distributed deep fake video 2 days before the election took place. So we have developed technology that can identify such deep fake videos. So it's a very wide range of tools that we use.
So yes, you're using those tools, but what kind of a role should the social media platforms play in the fight against election interference, or, as you've just mentioned, these deep fake videos?
Well, it's a difficult question, actually, because I'm very much in favor of free speech.
Yes.
And I'm not in favor of private companies, and social media companies are actually private companies, controlling and deciding what we can express of views. But on the other hand, of course, the social media platforms do have a responsibility to take down, obviously, fake news, etc., etc. But I would be reluctant to say that, for instance, the CEO of Facebook should have the authority to prohibit me from expressing my views. I wouldn't accept that.
Yeah, of course, of course. So how could this technological arms race be won, since we have seen enormous developments on the Chinese parts, let's say?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, because that's, I think, one essential element of this alliance of democracies, that we should also create what I have called a technological alliance of democracies to make sure that the use of new technology is based on the principles upon which we have established our societies. We cannot accept, for instance, the use of artificial intelligence that the Chinese have developed, where they use face recognition, for instance, to monitor, to control the people. That's not our philosophy. Of course, artificial intelligence can be used in two ways. It can be harmful and it can be useful. Yes. And we should make sure that the world, that at least the world's democracies agree on a certain number of principles upon which we will base the use of new technology. Because otherwise, it will be Beijing, Moscow, and the other autocrats that would dictate how we use new technology.
Mr. Rasmussen, as we're nearing towards the end of our discussion, just one quick question. We know that the relations between Turkey and the United States have been strained over various issues, but the two leaders will meet on the sidelines of the Nato summit in June to discuss ways how to overcome their differences. How do you see relations between the two countries moving forward? Just in 30 seconds, if you could wrap it up, I would appreciate that.
I can't do it in 30 seconds, but I can tell you that I consider Turkey a very important partner and ally. Partner of the European Union, ally within NATO, and it's in our strategic interest to keep Turkey on a Western-oriented and reform-oriented course. But of course, it is a matter of concern that Turkey has purchased Russian military equipment that is not compatible with NATO military equipment. So that's my real concern, that Turkey, by its own decisions, will be more and more marginalized when it comes to security. I don't think it's in the interest of Turkey. Okay. So my plea is that President Erdogan and President Biden try to overcome those differences, to speak very directly about it. Turkey must give up, refuse the purchase of Russian military equipment. And in exchange, the Americans should allow Turkey to be part of the F-35 fighter jet program. I think here we do have the core message to the two.
Well, Mr. Rasmussen, we have to wrap it out our conversation here. It was a pleasure talking with you, and good luck with your endeavors. And also, thank you very much for joining us on CSA Talks.
You're welcome. Thank you.